turns out the prisons are a relatively modern invention. This video will explore the origins of prison, how they came to be, why we have them today, and how they may evolve in the future. Enjoy. The oldest recorded legal code that we have in the archaeological record is the Code of Ur-Nammu, and it mentions imprisonment. It was written by ancient Mesopotamians, now modern-day Iraq, sometime between 2100 and 2050 BC, and it states that imprisonment is the appropriate punishment for kidnapping. Now, to put that time period into context, this was farther away in time between when it was written and when Jesus was alive than when Jesus was alive and today, which is to say, it's pretty dang old. Although, in another sense, it could be considered relatively recent, as modern humans are thought to have existed here on Earth anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 years. Note, this number keeps getting pushed back as new evidence is discovered. You see, for much of our history, we ran around as hunter-gatherers. In fact, some of us still do. But roughly 12,000 years ago, agrarian societies began to pop off in northern Africa, and it is from this era and region that we have the first evidence of writing. And in case you didn't know, history officially means the time after writing began, and the time before writing is considered prehistory or prehistoric. But I digress. While it is impossible to know whether or not prehistoric humans had prison, it is highly likely that they did not. First, none of the hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, such as the Sentinelese off the coast of India or the Toromona in South America, have prisons. It stands to reason that if these tribes don't have prisons now, then they didn't in prehistoric times either. Also, none of the various descriptions of Native American and Australian Aboriginals upon first contact of Europeans hundreds of years ago have any description of long-term imprisonment. Prisoners of war, yes. Enslavement, yes. And the classic torture and execution of convicted criminals, yes. But long-term imprisonment as a form of punishment, no. Also, consider this, many hunter-gatherer societies are nomadic, and as such do not have permanent structures that could serve as prisons. And even of the hunter-gatherer tribes who do have somewhat permanent structures, these structures do not seem to be the type that would serve well as prisons. For example, witnesses to the Sentinelese structures describe them as being temporary huts erected on 4 poles with slanted leaf-covered roofs. Certainly not the type of structures best suited to long-term imprisonment. And finally, imprisonment, as we think of it today, is an extremely expensive endeavor. One group of humans, known as guards, have to be provided calories so that they can sit around and watch another group of humans, known as prisoners, who also need calories. And while some prisons put their prisoners to work, say growing their own food, this still assumes agriculture. In a hunter-gatherer society, allowing your prisoners to go out to hunt and gather would be a great way to lose your prisoners to escape. So for all of these reasons why we can't know for certain, it seems highly unlikely that prehistoric humans had long-term imprisonment as a form of punishment. Now jumping back to ancient times, when writing first began, and as mentioned before, the Code of Ur-Nammu mentions imprisonment. Now a far more famous ancient legal code, the Code of Hammurabi, written 300 years after the Code of Ur-Nammu, and also from ancient Mesopotamia, mentions imprisonment as well. Here, interestingly, the Code of Hammurabi says that private citizens could imprison other private citizens for unpaid debts, but that if you beat your prisoner to death, then you yourself would be in trouble, and how much trouble you were in depended on whether the prisoner you beat to death was a slave or a freeborn person. Imprisonment, as contemplated here, had more to do with enslaving someone and putting them to work in order to pay off a debt than it had to do with just holding someone in a locked building for a set period of time. And again, this was something that the government, i.e. king, allowed private citizens to do to each other, not necessarily something that the government was interested in doing itself. While all ancient agrarian societies had some forms of imprisonment, most weren't really prisons as we think of them today. As far as governments went, usually they saw imprisonment as a way to temporarily hold someone awaiting their actual punishment, such as torture, execution, banishment, or being sold off as a slave, rather than imprisonment as a punishment itself. For example, in ancient Athens, Socrates was apparently held in one of these jail cells, a dungeon room carved out of a rock, before he was put on trial and forced to commit suicide. Ironically, he was one of the first humans on record to suggest that punishment could be good for one's soul, an early theory of punishment as rehabilitation. More on that later. In ancient Rome, There were several prisons which were really just dungeons, such as the Mamertine prison, built between 640 and 616 BCE. Originally intended to be a storm drain or a sewer, it was essentially a hole in the ground that prisoners would be lowered into by ropes. It is believed that both Peter and Paul from the Bible were held here before their execution. Rome also kept a myriad of prisoners of war as slaves, one famous example being the gladiators that were held against their will in a place called the Ludus Magnus. This is a place where they would live and train before being forced to fight to the death in the Colosseum. Again, society considered the punishment to be being forced to fight to the death, not so much having to live at the Ludus Magnus.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
Now, in ancient China, they were a bit unique in that they did use imprisonment as a form of punishment. In fact, in 754 AD, China had roughly 1,900 prisons. And while most crimes resulted in whipping, banishment, or execution, some crimes actually carried a sentence of imprisonment as punishment, with sentences usually being in the range of months rather than years. Now, in ancient Mesoamerica, that is South and Central America before Christopher Columbus came, the Aztecs had several forms of prison, ranging from a death row to a debtor's prison, and a prison for petty crimes. And obviously, various Mesoamerican cultures are famous for using prisoners of war for human sacrifices, whether that be the Maya, Aztecs, Inca, or a number of other Mesoamerican cultures. In ancient India, as in ancient Greece and Rome, prison was merely used as a means to temporarily hold someone before their actual punishment was imposed. These punishments were the typical ones seen all over the planet during ancient times: physical torture, execution, and enslavement in order to pay off a debt. In ancient Egypt, there were prisons. Court records from ancient Egypt survive to this day and reveal a system of official priests/judges who represented the pharaoh in both criminal and non-criminal legal cases. While no document has been uncovered that describes the length of sentences imposed, there are several documents that reveal the existence of prisoners, prison as a potential punishment, and the potential use of prisons for punishment as well as rehabilitation, although that last point is not entirely clear from the ancient record. You see, in all of these instances, while there was imprisonment, again, typically it was really a way of holding someone temporarily while waiting to give them their trial and/or actual punishment. And this remained the case all the way up to the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to focus a bit on England because this is where the first houses of correction were born, which represent the very first attempt at rehabilitation, at least in the Western world. But leading up to that, after ancient days, before the Enlightenment, the first dedicated jail in England was built in 1068 and was inside the Tower of London. Enemies of the state and royals were imprisoned here, and the imposing sight of the giant tower served as a visual reminder to the people of London just who was in charge. In 1166, Henry II ordered that the sheriff of every county in England build jails in their respective jurisdiction in order to hold defendants accused of crimes before their trial. In 1215, the Magna Carta was adopted, and it contained the radical idea that people should be convicted at trial before they are sentenced to prison. The first notion of holding someone against their will as a form of punishment and potentially for rehabilitation, at least in Western culture, first began in England in 1553. This is when the King of England, Henry VI, gave one of his palaces, known as Bridewell Palace, to the City of London to serve as a place to keep homeless children and, quote, disorderly women. It wasn't long before the site became a jail for petty offenses such as begging, prostitution, petty theft, or, quote, loose, idle, and disorderly conduct. Known as a house of correction, the idea was that the petty criminals kept there against their will could be improved upon in some way. By the 1770s, however, critics of the Bridewell system noted that prisoners were more likely to be corrupted by other prisoners than to be reformed by the system. Eventually, the original Bridewell was closed in 1855, but by this time, Bridewells had popped up all over England, Ireland, Scotland, Canada, and the United States. It is estimated that 170 Bridewells existed by the 1700s. It was also during this time that England got into the habit of turning entire parts of the world into giant prisons when it began shipping its convicted criminals abroad to its various colonies, such as to Australia, America, and India, to name just a few. By the end of the 1700s, more than 50,000 prisoners had been, quote, transported in just such a fashion. This method of using a location far removed from a culture's center as a form of prison sentence was also used by France, who would send prisoners to French Guiana, and Russia, who would send the convicted prisoners to Siberia. Now, in early America, as the Industrial Revolution began to kick off in England in 1760, and then soon afterwards in America, the first waves of prison reform began. The first prison reform movements were largely spurred on by religious groups who thought that the idea of rehabilitation should be taken much more seriously. After all, the conditions in the bridewells were typically horrific, and actual rehabilitation seemed to be close to non-existent. Specifically, the Quakers in early America set up the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. This organization set up the first, quote, penitentiaries, based on the philosophy that convicted criminals should be forced into a period of penance. That is, time in solitary confinement where they could read the Bible, pray, and reflect on their wrongdoing, all in the hopes that one could evolve out of their criminal ways. The first such penitentiary was built in Philadelphia in 1790. This new style of prison included a slew of new and radical ideas, such as separating petty from serious criminals, separating men from women, and offering healthcare, education, and religious services. Most of all, prisoners were expected to work, and were kept busy creating products that could be sold to the public outside of the prison, idle hands and all that. Also, solitary confinement was used in the place of corporal punishment, as punishment for disciplinary infractions within the prison, although some critics noticed that this practice had a tendency to drive inmates insane. A major prison reformer and Quaker named Thomas Eddy was key in expanding this new model of prison, getting the first penitentiary in New York City opened and later a similar penitentiary in upstate New York. While these new prisons were much improved from the disgusting conditions of dungeons or the dirty and dangerous bridewells of England, they were far from soft. During the day, prisoners would work in strict silence, not even being allowed to make eye contact with each other, and guards would whip them for even the slightest infraction. By the end of Thomas Eddy's penal career, his views of prison had changed. He noted that the system had a tendency to harden even the most minor criminals, making it even harder to actually reform them, and the society would be better off focusing on the root cause of crime rather than focusing solely on the punishment of criminals. More on that later. Now, prisons continued to evolve throughout the 1800s. In 1825, New York built its first prison, or reform school, for juveniles. This trend continued into the formation of the public school system that we have today. In 1835, New York built the first all-women's prison. It was soon staffed by female guards to reduce the incidence of rape that had previously occurred by male prisoners and male prison guards against female inmates. And in the 1840s, a movement began to remove the mentally ill from jails and prisons and place them in mental hospitals, where they could hopefully retrieve medical treatment instead of punishment. In the 1850s, many states began to do away with debtors' prisons, where people were often kept in prison for simply not having enough money to pay their debts. Instead, workhouses were built whereby debtors could work their debts off without being subjected to the same living conditions as the criminals being punished in prison. After the Civil War in the United States, which ran from 1861 to 1865, a new kind of prison reform began, which focused on using science and statistics to reduce the incidence of crime. This led to the parole system, in which an attempt was made to help inmates readjust back to life in society after prison. It was also during this time that the administration of prisons were moved from various local authorities, often corrupt, to state agencies. There was a belief that prisons should be run by penal professionals who had devoted their careers to running such institutions, instead of various local authorities. Now, by the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, a new period began in American thought, in which many radical ideas were proposed and adopted. This period is known as the Progressive Era. These ideas range from regulating the additives in our food supply to the creation of child labor laws, the creation of the minimum wage, the creation of national parks, and even allowing women the right to vote. There were also many reforms made to prison during this time. For example, it was at this time that probation came on the scene, not to be confused with parole. While parole focused on helping a formerly incarcerated inmate readjust back into society after prison, probation focused on intervening in a person's life instead of prison. A person would be assigned to a probation officer who would attempt to rehabilitate a person who had broken the law before they were dumped into the prison system. Unfortunately, as with many potentially good ideas in the criminal justice system, the implementation of programs such as probation were often underfunded, with too few probation officers having too many probationers to supervise. It was also during this time that indeterminate sentences were used. A person would be sentenced to a wide range of possible years in prison, with the possibility of being released early if they could prove to prison experts, such as parole boards, that they had rehabilitated themselves. The idea behind this was that people should only be in prison for as long as it takes for rehabilitation, no more and no less. Again, however, the problem was that the parole boards, relied upon to determine whether a prisoner could end their sentence early, were often overburdened, and it turned out that inmates ended up doing more time, on average, than before parole boards were implemented.
Sit. We see by your file you've served 20 years of a life sentence.
Yes, sir.
You feel you've been rehabilitated?
Oh, yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. I mean, I learned my lesson. I can honestly say that I'm a changed man. And I'm no longer a danger to society. That's God's honest truth.
Furthermore, the public had a tendency to dislike the idea of parole, as they thought it allowed criminals out earlier than they should be, even though it actually kept them in longer. Prison reformers also began to protest against the use of prison labor, and specifically the use of chain gangs. Most popular in the southern states, prisoners would be chained together and forced to perform heavy manual labor, not exactly a good look, where many prisoners were black, and where slavery had supposedly just been abolished decades before, in the very region that had fought in the Civil War to keep it. Other than a resurgence of chain gangs in a few states in the 1990s, the practice had essentially been ended by the middle of the 1900s. Over time, many states banned various forms of prison labor, due to critics arguing that there was too much potential for inmate abuse, where the prison could earn a profit from its inmates' forced labor. In the middle of the 1900s, the prison population grew while states resisted building more prisons due to cost. As a result, prisons became much more crowded and overall conditions declined. This led to a series of violent riots that erupted all over the country. These included 2 riots in a New Jersey prison in 1952, in which guards were taken hostage and prison property destroyed. A major riot at San Quentin Prison in 1967, a riot at California's Folsom Prison in 1970, and a major prison riot at Attica Prison in New York in 1971. These are just a few of the prison riots during this time. This last one mentioned, Attica, resulted in hundreds of state troopers and National Guard being called in to quell the rebellion. Dozens of prisoners and some hostages were killed in the process, when these soldiers and police opened fire on the inmates. In all of these riots, prisoners demanded an improvement in their living conditions with varying degrees of success. In the late 1900s, prison populations in the U.S. began to rise dramatically, mostly as a result to the war on drugs and 3 strike laws that gave mandatory life sentences for a person's 3rd serious felony conviction. Now, while various forms of private businesses had always made money from the labor of slaves and/or prisoners, it was in the mid-1980s that the first corporate private prison was born. Now, while people believe that most of the prisons in America have become privatized, in fact, today roughly only 8% of incarcerated in the U.S. are doing time in a private for-profit prison. In the early 1970s, the total population of the U.S. that was in some form of incarceration was 360,000. By the 2020s, this number had reached nearly 2 million in some form of incarceration, with another 3 to 4 million on either probation or parole. This is over a 500% increase in the number of prisoners in America. This has caused the U.S. to have the greatest number of people in prison in the world, as well as one of the highest percentages of its population incarcerated. Of note, the U.S. prison population has actually declined from its all-time high around 2008 to 2009. As such, the U.S. can no longer claim the number 1 spot as having the highest percentage of its population in prison, now being beat out by El Salvador, Rwanda, Turkmenistan, American Samoa, and Cuba. Now globally, of the 193 countries with the seat at the United Nations, all of them have some form of prison system, with an extremely wide range of schemes, attempting to address crime and punishment in their respective countries. This ranges from a prison in the Philippines that makes their prisoners dance to choreographed routines, to prisons in India that teach meditation. In Bolivia, there's a prison system set up like a small village where prisoners are allowed to bring in their families to live, There are restaurants, schools, barbershops, and even a real estate market. Russia has a prison called the Black Dolphin, where prisoners are walked around hunched over and blindfolded, and other prisons around the world have living conditions ranging from absolutely horrific to quite posh. For example, in Norway, there exists what some call the softest prison in the world. Inmates in the maximum security Halden prison have keys to their own private dormitory-style rooms, private bathrooms, access to a library, gym, and even a music recording studio. They socialize with guards, who enjoy coffee and meals with them. Inmates cook their own meals in their own kitchens. The prison has lots of natural light, greenery, and is even filled with modern art on the walls. Not surprisingly, with such a wide variety of prison in the world, there is a wide variety of recidivism rates. Although it may not be what you would expect. You would think that the prisons with the harshest conditions would have the lowest recidivism rates, as prisoners would be so fearful of ever going back that they would give up their life of crime. But in fact, the opposite is true. It turns out that Halden Prison, again considered the softest prison in the world, also has the lowest recidivism rate in the world. Their philosophy is that if you treat humans like animals, then you will get animals. But if the softest prison in the world creates the lowest recidivism rate in the world, then the goals of punishment and rehabilitation come in a direct conflict with each other. There's little doubt that how our society and our species around the globe deals with crime and punishment will continue to evolve. Today, some argue that prisons must become harsher. Others, the prison needs to focus more on rehabilitation. Some call for the complete abolishment of prison altogether. Perhaps the most moderate and well-reasoned reform idea is an argument put forth by a man named Brandon Matthews. Brandon is a man who has spent his career working in the criminal justice system, both as a prison guard and as a probation officer. Brandon argues that since the goal of punishment and the goal of rehabilitation naturally contradict each other, it is unwise to ask a single institution to carry out both goals at the same time and expect success, and that these goals should be separated into separate institutions. A link to his TED Talk can be found in the description below. But what do you think? Are our prisons too soft or too harsh? Or perhaps you think our current system is perfect as it is? Let me know in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, if you learned something new, or if it caused you to think, and assuming that you actually like learning and or thinking, please give us a like. And if you want to see more videos exploring various aspects of the criminal justice system, consider checking out our other videos on our channel and subscribing. Thanks for watching.